And what's the format for you
It's
responding?
It's on the website, isn't it, Joshua? That question, just put it on, put the questions on the website and we'll go forward as usual. You know that, Dan.
Actually, you haven't responded to any of my open records requests, so I don't know that.
That's fine. Is that the public comment at that point? Any other public comments? Okay, let's begin with the Raftelis recommendation. Andrew, can you please introduce yourself? And I'm going to introduce the board members at this point.
Sure.
This is Joshua Anderson.
Simpson.
Peyton's under the weather. He's decided to just kind of, he's in the office, but at this point, because of the fact that of the infection rates, he's just going to kind of be there. But Josh is going to take over at this point. I'm Mean Cabrera.
David Graves. Tom Zubula.
Is that all right if I come up?
Yeah, please.
Here.
Thank you.
You know what? I'm gonna move over here just so as people are looking.
Thank you.
My name's Andrew Rheem, and I appreciate the introduction. As indicated, I'm here to present some preliminary results from the rate and fee study that Raftelis has completed. Yeah, and as we get started, just kind of maybe some big picture sort of comments. From a timing standpoint, sometimes when we get to this point in this type of a study, we're looking, the next step would be to finalize the recommendations, start sort of the public hearing process, outreach process with the community, a notification but because
let me introduce you. This is Brandon Hurst. He's another board member. This is Andrew Rheem, and then there's Willow Cutstrap. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, me. So this speaks to the action and the next steps. Because of the city purchase water costs and that potentially, the city evaluating this and planning to update the rate study and potentially change the rates under the same time period, we kind of want to wait until that happens before we finalize the rate recommendations, just because of that cost, and that cost component is such a big driver. So that I'll touch on this later on in terms of the potential next steps and going through that more formal public hearing process. And we're planning to do that sort of late spring when we've got the finalized city purchase cost information and we incorporate it. With that said, we took our best estimate, made our best guess, and certainly looked at that variable component, as we'll see in some of the results. Just in terms of finalizing and going, forward with final rate recommendations, that creates a little bit of a different process in that, a lot of the discussion today is going to be about the big picture financial plan, how we fund the capital plan, and then the other element of our study really looking at rates and rate structure. So we do have numbers and bill impacts, but we're also looking for some reaction, some direction. And we've got plenty, we've got a lot of time between now and sort of April and May, and there's, potential to make some big changes, or, we can look at, and I've got some questions, we can look at maybe phasing things a little bit over.
But you got a high and a low on that too, don't you? About those rate studies that we're looking at, according to where we're at.
Yeah, and there's a little bit, you got it, there's a bit of a range in just in terms of maybe the city's increase a little bit higher than what this base plan has and what that could mean. But certainly a little more uncertainty, but that's somewhat of the kind of the nature of the district's finances and how the treated water is provided. So just want a little bit of a background there is before we dive into heavy dose of numbers. In terms of the agenda, and this is similar to the scope of services that we had, the main parts of the study. So I'm going to start a little bit with a little bit of kind of a refresh and overview. Those that were part of it, not all the board members were part of this, I don't believe, but we did a rate and fee 101 presentation about 6 months ago. And so, that kind of sets the stage a bit, and then we'll get a little bit more into the specific rates, fees themselves, as well as the one-time capital recovery fees. In kind of how we got, asked and to complete the study and to evaluate is really, if we were able to, as the district, have a number of years, had sufficient revenue to fund, operations capital, have, healthy cash reserves, expand capacity and ultimately, provide, the service, to customers for least possible rate. And that's been, the case and still is the case. But as we move forward, we need to increase the revenues for the district. If we don't do anything, and certainly we'll grow and add customers, but that just isn't sufficient. We're going to get into, as we're seeing a little bit more financial pressure. And there's really like three drivers I want to talk about. Inflationary increases, whether it's a water district or really, as we've all experienced the last few years, the price of many things is going up. So just the cost of the status quo is going to increase over time. We do nothing more than just exist. Our costs are going up, as well as potentially a substantial increase with our biggest cost, the purchase water. In terms of capital projects, and I know Lowell's going to talk a bit about the recommendations, the outcomes of the interstate valuation. That's another driver. And, it's not just growing or expanding capacity, it's replacing, it's maintaining service levels. Like any kind of mechanical fixed system, things wear out, things get old, things need to be rehabilitated, replaced. And so that's a driver, certainly. And then the city purchase water costs, that's the third component. So all of these three come together, and between the different funding sources and revenues that we have, as well as some potential capital funding sources to help smooth things out, I think we can get there. But as we're seeing, it's going to be likely a little bit more than just sort of inflationary adjustments. I guess the other thing that I wanted to highlight when we're talking, in a district versus a municipality versus other types of local governments, they vary. And districts have a lot of benefits and how they're operating. Like the Heights Water District provides water, and that's it. Now, on the other side, though, the mix of revenues and funding sources is much more narrow as well. And so while as, cities next door, they have sales tax revenues, plan, different types of potential other taxes, other types of fees, gas tax, all these different components. Now, they're a lot more complicated too with additional service offerings, but I just kind of want to mention that their options that they have are greater than water district, or in this case, the Heights Water District. So, at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game. And we've got 2 or 3 major revenue streams, and then, certainly the ability to borrow money to help smooth things out. But that's about it. And there's not many other options that we have when it comes to funding our requirements. So then the rate study process comes in, and this is very similar to how our scope is structured. Where we, all right, downside of having it back behind me. Anyway, the slides. All right, so sorry about that. The first question, and this is really where I'm, going to start the presentation, the discussion, is overall how much do we need? And this is not just next year, but this we're looking at over a 10-year period. And this is where the capital plan, both in the district as well as what Interstate has identified, and those two are the same. We're able to look out over that horizon and answer some of the questions about really how much money do we need, when do we need it, can we cash fund everything? And I'm kind of in the recommendations indicating that I don't think we can, at least not with really significant initial near-term rate adjustments, which certainly that may be some of the direction we get to pursue that path. But most times we want to find a little bit more of a balance and kind of flatten things out. There's also the reinvestment in the system. These facilities are going to be around for a long time. So I think that there can be some benefit, like any type of enterprise, of having some debt and debt funding some of those long range requirements. We don't want to do it, we can't do it in our operating costs. There's certain types of capital maybe we would like not to debt fund to really build into the rates. But those periodic one-time reinvestments in the system, that can make sense from a financial standpoint as well as an equity standpoint. Then, as we continue on our path, and this was part of our scope and analysis, is a question of cost of service. And the different types and users of the system, is everyone paying their fair share? And, as that may increase over time with the financial plan and adjustments, and that's also somewhat of a forward-looking item where over time, and this is something maybe the district hasn't done across the different classes of users, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the existing rates and some of the trade-offs with what we have in place today, and how that influences the cost of service. We've got some outcomes and some components with that. The other leg is, rates and rate structure. And we've got some potential changes, and some of them, are really kind of significant. I mean, some of them are incremental, a little bit on the margins, but other ones are potential bigger changes to the rate structure itself. And how that may impact customers and customer bills is often an important consideration as, boards and districts and utilities evaluate different ways of recovering that same amount of revenue. So I'm going to talk about a couple alternatives we've developed. They're not that different, and we're looking for a little bit of direction around some key questions, and there may be an opportunity to look out, and rather than take as big of a step with the rate structure, maybe do it over a couple of years, and sync that up with the 2-year cycle that the city has historically followed as well. But again, that I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit in terms of some of the questions and the direction that we'll be looking for. And kind of lastly, it's really not last in the process, it's really part of that financial plan, but whether it's tap fees, and I've sort of generalized the term to capital recovery fees. These are the one-time fees assessed to new development. And they are designed to recover the cost and reimburse or recover the cost of growth-related infrastructure. We'll visit, a couple different ways of evaluating and setting this fee and some of the drivers. Ultimately, we've got some recommendations for potential changes in policies, as well as a change in the fee itself. So that encompasses the discussion today in terms of the main topics as well as the scope of our study. So now I'm going to kind of go back to the big picture financial plan and start there. And really, this is that first kind of step, and direction changes on this is going to influence the other parts of this process. So this is a good one for us to kind of all be comfortable with, and not necessarily. Sometimes we focus a little bit too much, in my opinion, on rates, in these types of discussions, and forget about some of the big picture items as well. So when it comes to utility, like the district, we've got really a 3-prong test, or 3 different goals when we're looking at the sufficiency of our revenues. And going back to, we pretty much user charge revenues, some of the capital recovery fees, but that's about it. We charge ancillary activity-based fees for activities, but really it's that user charge and to some degree the capital recovery fees. And so we really look at 3 questions as we're evaluating. 1, are we able to fund our annual expenses? If we're not, that's going to drive the need to adjust or increase rates or revenues, or for us to defer and delay expenses. It's 2 sides of the coin. Then we get into 2 different types of financial performance thresholds or tests. And these are part of the legal obligations the district has already entered into and anticipating. They're very common. But there's a legal requirement, a debt service coverage requirement tied to the outstanding debt that the district has. And so we're easily able to meet it. Over time, it comes in as a constraint, but ultimately that's something that legally we'll need to maintain, and we want to maintain because we want to be able to borrow money in the future as well. This, and I'm not going to focus as much on this target, we can talk about it, but it's basically what the lender puts in to ensure that they'll be repaid. And so it's a calculation that takes the user charge revenue and subtracts the operation and maintenance expenses, and then it it just calculates the net revenue after operation and maintenance as divided by annual debt service. So if you've got a ratio of 1, it means that we've got the cash to make the current debt service payment. Now, there's other expenses that we have that are after debt service, and these are largely capital. So even if we're above M1, it doesn't mean that, the district has a profit or, generating income, gaining income. It really just means that we're paying operation and maintenance expenses. We have enough for debt service. And then, anything above 1 that is available to fund capital or put in reserves and fund future capital, essentially. The other financial performance driver, it's really tied to funding the expenses, but it's not just saying we want to be at $0 at the end of every fiscal year. We're saying that, well, we want to plan and have a floor that's a little bit above that. And the district has a policy in place that we look at about $500,000 is the amount of cash that we don't want to fall below. I'm recommending that we add an additional layer to that, this 90 days of operation and maintenance expenses. This is often, we talk about this being the checking account, just based on the services that are provided. The district is paying for something, whether it's personnel costs or, the power costs to pump water or the water that's purchased from the city in advance of when we're billing it, in advance of when we're collecting it. So we put in this type of a reserve to basically it's working capital. It's any kind of enterprise or business, you gotta have a little liquidity to allow yourselves to operate, and that's essentially what it is. 90 days is really for water utility about the bare minimum. So these may be some policies that the district continues to revisit over time, and I could see potentially having that capital reserve that's right around that existing policy of $500,000 and maybe tracking that up over time. But we've got enough kind of near-term challenges, so it can be difficult to try and build all of these things in at once.
Your 90 days
Mhm.
are current 90 days, and this time of year, our revenues are real low. Water usage is low, but you get to the summer, July, August, September, then our 90-day period is huge. So what kind of a 90-day period are you talking? A 90-day average of a year, or are you talking a particular 90 days to use your 25% of?
We don't get as granular and track it seasonally. We peg it to the operation and maintenance expenses that are annual. So it kind of averages, you're usually talking on the revenue side,
Right.
we kind of flatten it out and peg it to an expense. And it is based on the full year. We're not trying to move it around and have it change throughout the year.
So you're 25% of the 90-day period, you're taking our annual budget, dividing it by 4, and then taking 25% of that to come up with this, that's your rationale here?
More or less. I mean, it's not quite the annual budget in that there's components like debt
Right,
service and
right.
capital
Right,
that are outside of this, but you're spot on.
okay.
Now, in terms of getting into one of the big drivers I talked about, capital, prioritized capital plan that's been identified. So what this shows is a few things. This shows the dollar amount of the kind of totality of projects that we've got scheduled and anticipated, and this is informed based on the interstate evaluation, and certainly a lot of work and a lot of thought in terms of the sequence of this, and as you all have spoken about and heard, there's a prioritization behind the scenes in terms of the projects and what's up first that makes up these charts and these bars on the chart. Now, from a capital funding standpoint, this reflects the base capital plan, referring to as the base plan, where in a perfect world we'd fund this all with cash. And we'd have the money or, plan for it, and we'd have the ability to cash fund these. Now, it's pretty substantial, as you look at some of the reinvestments to, on one hand, accumulating all this cash for a number of years to have it spend, that would have been a little bit of a challenge from a customer standpoint. But I mean, ultimately, the options would be maybe we push these out and save up enough cash to get there. Or is what I'm recommending is we look to external sources to help flatten out the liabilities. We'll have some debt service that's going to continue for a number of years, but it allows us to move forward with these, one-time kind of investments, if you will, and then manage a bit how we pay it back over time. So it's not that equal $3 million a year that the annual average is. As we can see, it goes up and down each year, and about 2/3 of the plan I'm proposing or projecting to be debt funded. Now, we're not making a decision today or 6 months from now that's gonna lock this all in. There's certainly some near-term projects where that will end up ultimately being the case. But as the district is pursuing grant opportunities, low-interest loans, and ultimately, we want to be fiscally responsible and fund this in the most prudent way that we can. So we may end up ultimately getting more grant money than what this plan has. But I just don't like banking on things that haven't happened. So regardless of how we fund it, these are prioritized needs that we're, as a district, we're recommending we move forward with. And so this, whether it's a loan or a grant, we're pulling in some external funding sources. Now, if we get more grant dollars, really, we're not banking on those, then this makes the future adjustments easier. It allows us to maybe cash fund some of these future projects that are indicated as debt funded or have a little bit of a different balance. And this goes to updating and evaluating this plan. Maybe not this type of a study, certainly not every year, but periodically or as things change and kind of course correcting along the way, or if something significant or substantial changes, taking action.
So what you're saying on this one, is the fact in 2023-24, we'll have a high debt service, but by the year 2030, that debt service has gone away because we started to pay on it, is that what I'm seeing?
This is more of the one-time funding source, so this is the borrowing, so it's the amount of external debt.
2023? Okay.
And then the debt service will continue for 30 years. And so this is just showing how we're funding the capital, but the next slide is gonna speak to that comment in terms of that annual outcome. So now I'm kind of turning the attention, it's related to this certainly. So I'm tracking a couple things in this, and this is really, it's oversimplification, but it breaks out our four main expense types, and it looks at it with the current budget that we're in fiscal year 22-23, and looks out 3 years within what we're projecting and forecasting under this base plan. So the first bar is the purchase water costs, and what, kind of anticipating or projecting that to be both as we grow and purchase more water, and ultimately the rate that the city assesses for that purchase water. And we can talk about what that variable is, but basically the base plan has that going up $600,000 for the first 2 years, and then maybe flat. The rate of increase maybe flattens out a little bit. So we can see the percentage of our expenditures, if you will, we're about half today with that cost. And as it tracks up, we get to about 60%. So of all the bills that we're paying, setting aside kind of that debt funded capital piece, about half to about 60% of the district's cost. Then that second area is the district operation and maintenance expenses, personnel, our power costs, meters, all of that translates to about $1.6 million today, a little less than a third. And that's going up at a lower pace than, say, the city purchase water costs. So that percentage of the total is going down a little bit. It's not that the cost is going down, it's just the pie is getting bigger, and that sort of portion of the pie isn't growing at the same level as the overall pie. Now we get into debt service and cash funding capital, and these can be a little bit more of our variable pieces. I've talked about how we fund capital, and the amount of capital is often, utility or district, it's how we balance things year over year, and that with our cash reserves. But today we have about $400,000 annual debt service, and there's a little bit of delay from when we borrow the money, we build the project, and then we have to start paying it back. So we're starting to see, going back to this slide, those 23, 24, 24, 25 debt issuances manifesting themselves as the annual debt service. So it goes from $400,000 to about $1 million a year in that third year. And again, as a percent of our expenses, it's not a large percentage today, it's under 10%, and it starts to, as the pie is getting bigger, that portion's also getting bigger. So by the third year, that green part, we're at about 13% of our annual expenses in that year being debt service. So it's tracking up, but it's not what I consider to be overly leveraged, and the debt service coverage married with the rate adjustments is very solid, very sound. Yes,
What do you consider over too much debt? What percentage would you say, Andrew?
Some of the rules for private companies, some utilities follow, there's sort of a 60-40 equity debt kind of split that, private sector looks at. So I mean, that can be a metric. I would say that, debt service coverage is a better way to kind of evaluate that for a utility, because that's gonna more constrain the capacity to borrow. So, I'm struggling a little bit answering the question, because I don't know that there's a single rule of thumb. And the other thing that changes things for the district is that if the district had its own water treatment plant, then the amount of capital and debt would be different. Now that the city kind of handles those and makes those decisions, so that also would reduce it, for the case of Heights, what I consider to be, kind of a debt to equity percentage, versus a utility that had their own water production and treatment facilities.
One more question. So what you're anticipating on purchasing of water, 2.8 million to, let's say 2024, 4.0 million, that's a 70% increase in, purchased water, at that point, correct? If you take 2.8 divided by 4.0, that's a 70% increase in what we're planning to purchase water from the city at that point. Is that what you're seeing?
I may be oriented a little bit slightly different, but, so 1.2 million to the 2.8, so that represents, about, quick math in my head, about 30%.
Okay,
And it's like, it's somewhere in there. We're anticipating basically a 15%. I'm projecting and kind of guessing a 15% increase in the rate in 23-24, and a 15% in 24-25. So as those compound, and then we're in, as we're growing, we've got, some additional purchased water independent of the rate. So it's right around the 33% over that kind of cumulative over that 2-year period, using, some round numbers.
On debt, the higher our percent of debt for our revenue goes, the harder it is to borrow. At what point would you say we're getting to where our borrowing is gonna cost us interest? Are we in a super good zone, a moderate zone, or a poor zone with our projections here?
I'd say that, the lender that we're anticipating to borrow from is the state revolving fund loan. So they're, set up to help entities like Heights, and so that you don't need to necessarily go to a bank or go to Wall Street and borrow money with your own credit. And so because of that, it's the cost of interest is less based on the Heights financial position, and it's more based on the SRF's portfolio. And so they're gonna be the entity. It's not necessarily gonna be the lender, Wall Street, that's saying, you don't have enough money. It's really gonna be the state agency that manages that program. And it's not as much of a one-for-one for the interest rate. So I guess at one point, like, it's not gonna hit a dollar for dollar the same way it would be if, me as an individual or the district as an individual went and borrowed on your own. But the way that we often constrain it is debt service coverage. And that's how ultimately the state and they're gonna be concerned about, if we lend you this money with your other liabilities and your operating costs, can you pay us back? Because they wanna get paid back, so then they can put it back in the revolving fund and you loan it to another utility, and kind of it's really microfinancing, and it's sort of the state level. But debt service coverage is really where that constraint comes in. And that's something that we're looking at, and I can pull up a chart and we kind of show where it's at. It's in pretty good shape, so I mean, frankly, the district could maybe borrow a little bit more money. The other constraint on the amount that we may wanna borrow is the capital plan itself. And so, we can't necessarily, we can't go to the state and borrow money for our operation and maintenance expenses. They won't lend it to us, and, it's, that's prudent financially, that makes sense. But so that limitation is, how much capital do we have? That's gonna be one limitation, and then our ability to, frankly, pay it back and meet that debt service coverage requirement. And I guess, well, I'll stop there.
All right, I've got one other question. Now, I've reviewed all of this,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not quite sure I understand. You don't show 21, 22 where we are now on your chart here.
All right.
what percent increase where are we at 21, 22 with cost of water, for instance? I understand our operation maintenance, but our cost of water, what do you have us at this year? You've got 2.8 next year. Where are we at this year?
The 2 point is a component of the budget.
22, 23, but right now, this year, we're at what?
Let me verify that. If I can find it first. It's about 2.7 million.
2.7 for 21, 22.
Yeah, and that was an actual number. That was actual cost.
That's what yeah, okay.
And so there's a couple of components in that. I mean, the amount of water that we're buying, and that, weather dependent. But yeah, the rate itself, I want to say, Josh, can you help me out? Is it $2.97 per 1,000 gallons? City charges today.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll double check that and make sure.
I got that right here somewhere.
So, and I know I'm covering a lot, and so let me know if I'm going a little too quick, but as was commented, as we're looking and evaluating, base case, is one option, and there's certainly some uncertainty, but we also looked at a couple different scenarios. There are a lot of different ways of peeling the onion, so to speak, and we've got some different options. Certainly, some of the direction and discussion may inform this, but we developed two different base cases. One of them has us, and it's around the three-pronged test that we talked about. Both of them fund our expenses each year, and debt service coverage, we're above and in good shape on both of them with the adjustments. And then we're exceeding and really at our cash reserve targets, but we're doing it in a couple different ways. Under the base plan, I'm giving us a few years. We're still in the black. We still have money each year. We're just working our way up towards that target as we're borrowing some additional money, and we've got some near-term increases in a couple of our key costs. Now, there's a second plan that I'm going to show you in a minute that doesn't give us 4 years to get there. It does it over 2 years. And so how to do it faster is we've got higher rates, frankly, and everything else is the same. The amount we're borrowing, the expenses, and it's just a matter of how quickly we want to get to those cash reserve targets. Now, there's a second set of scenarios that I'm talking about as well, and this is where it's certainly a little bit outside of our control. So in that base case, is the city was looking at setting the rate for this year previously. They were asking for about a 30% increase in the rate in that second year. So, and whether that's going to end up being higher or different, we'll know in a few months. But basically splitting that into a 2-year increase is what we've got in the base plan. So 15 years instead of going up in that 1 year, I'm anticipating maybe it'll take them a little longer to construct the capital and net of all the other variables that they're balancing. So maybe it's a 15% increase in the first year, 15% in the next year. And then we get to kind of this 4% a year, long range kind of inflationary adjustment for that cost moving forward, 4% a year thereafter each year. Now, it could be higher, it could be lower, and then also to kind of articulate the impact of this cost center in terms of that base plan. That's also why that lower increase plan is in place. So these are maybe some endpoints. It could be higher than 30%, but at least it gives us a way to look at this one significant cost, how it influences and affects the recommendations, independent of any other changes to the plan. So let's talk about results. So this is just that base case plan and how quickly we may want to get to that cash reserve target. So 14%, 13%, 9% is the kind of base plan I'm recommending. It gives us 4 years to get to that reserve target, and it's a little flatter. It's still steeper than we'd like and historically been there, but it's a little bit of a flatter way to get there. And then we're kind of, more or less inflationary adjustments for the balance of the planning period. Contrasting that with trying to get to that cash reserve target in a quicker set of steps, forecasting 20% increases for 2 years in a row. So it ends up being about a 50% increase in our rate revenues over a 2-year period. We get there more quickly. And then after that, it's more or less, city purchase costs and some of the other drivers. as we'll see, you know, it's like you're flying a plane and you're heading down, like, you know, get closer to the ground, you gotta pull up real fast. And so that's the sort of, you know, as we're pulling up, how quickly, you know, are we trying to pull up? It is basically the analogy that I'm seeing there. Now, what does this mean to the customer? And I want to caveat this, that this chart is used, and this comparison is really to compare plans. We could certainly adopt a 14% or 20% increase to our existing rates and fees as they are, our monthly ones, and generate the amount of revenue that is indicated here. Now, if we did that, that's how it would translate into a monthly bill for a typical customer. So a typical customer uses about 10,000 gallons a month. As was pointed out earlier, that's kind of an annual average, and certainly, you know, winter and summer, it's going to vary a bit. But just to help simplify that, boil it down to a single bill, that's about $52 today. And as we see, well, you know, 20% versus 14%, man, that's a pretty big percentage difference at 6%. That translates to about $3 a month in that first increase. And then it certainly compounds and accumulates over time. But some interesting things happen when we do this. So the blue bars is getting there faster, and we've got higher bill impacts initially. But because we're taking those steps earlier, we're generating more revenue early in our plan. That means that over time, the pace increases flatten out a little bit. And this is all projections, and, you know, life will intercede before we get to fiscal year 2030 and 31, and, you know, these plans will get updated, the drivers will change. But from a kind of looking out standpoint, this has us, you know, increasing, you know, the bill over these two plans, and roughly at $40 a month. So I mean, again, it's a pretty healthy increase. Now, this anticipates we maintain the current rate structure. As we look at rate alternatives, the impacts could be a little bit higher, depending on some of the things that I'm proposing to do on the rate structure as well. But just comparing how quickly we may want to get to target, you know, if we get there faster, you know, we're going to impact customers a little bit, certainly more earlier. And then over time, those two plans basically merge. They're basically the same. I know there's some differences, but, you know, a couple bucks a month isn't a substantial difference. So, and this is showing just the base case scenario, but just in terms of kind of showing this mathematically, we've got, this is the end of fiscal year cash. So at June 23, June 24, this is what the plan is forecasting to be there, and just cash and liquidity. Getting to be about $1 million, and we're climbing towards that target. That fourth year at the end of fiscal year 26-27, that's when we get to that, you know, a cash reserve target I'm recommending. That step up from where it is in 22-23 to 23-24 is us picking up the 90 days of O&M in that target. So it's not that our expenses went up that much necessarily, although they will, but it's picking up that additional target. So that adds 1.3 million, and it basically cash at the end of the year that, you know, we're having in reserve. So even, you know, and that's why I'm comfortable with the base plan. While, you know, our liquidity is about the same, it's improving a bit. And then we're tracking towards that target over time. And then certainly as we get in the out years, as we bounce around with our capital plan, we're at around or a little bit above that target each year.
So this is using the orange from the previous page.
Blue, I think, the base case.
It's orange.
Is it the orange? Oh.
Yeah.
Because that's getting there in 4 years. So if we use the blue from this previous page, we'd meet our projections in 2 years. Is that correct?
That is correct. By 24-25, we basically have that blue bar would be right at that green line.
At our green line.
So now I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about this kind of, you know, maybe a little over endpoints and the impact of this purchase water cost. So the base case, we've got 15% in 23, 24, and another 15% 24, 25. And then on these other two options, the 4% is basically what I consider inflationary adjustments each year, kind of that you know, not significant capital on the city side, not a significant increase that they're asking for. And then the blue bar, and I'm not going to say that's worst case scenario. That is a you know, potential scenario, and certainly what the city was essentially asking for to be in place already this year, the 30% increase. And so again, this tracks that same metric, where we may be as we go out to the end between the orange and the blue, we're kind of in the same spot. Now, how we get there, similar to the other plan, is a little bit different. And that, with a 30% increase, that's certainly putting pressure, but it's not the only thing that's putting pressure on our rates. As we can see with the gray bars, the capital plan and the inflationary cost on the district's expenses are also a driver. And so it's not just the city purchased water. Now, it is a significant driver, and it's also something that we're not able to debt fund. So, as we look at how we recover that and cash flow it, our option is rates and rates. That's it. Whereas, with capital, we can smooth things out a little bit, and we also have the capital recovery fees as well. So I know there's some hesitation, a lot of numbers, like, as I said earlier, these are gonna change, and it's a multi-year projection. So, as we're looking at this plan or potential adjustments in the future, certainly those can move and change. So I'm prepared to switch focus to the capital recovery fees unless there's any other kind of questions and comments on say the financial plan.
My only question is, Andrew, did you talk to the city about what they were talking about in terms of rate increases and stuff like that?
I haven't had any direct conversations with the city, and I'm certainly curious, but I'm working off kind of the correspondence back and forth and really their previous rate study and just kind of our understanding of some of their cost drivers.
You've looked at the letters that we've had in regards to what they were considering for rate increases.
Correct.
Over the last 3 months, 4 months, or maybe it's 6 months.
Yeah, I have, but it just in terms I'm not having direct conversations.
That's fine.
And I'm aware of things,
Yeah.
but I'm also, as the district, I'm certainly interested and curious, and would, be happy to talk with them or get some insight on where they think this may go, and that certainly gives the district more time to incorporate and make some changes. Historically, they provided their draft study to the district usually around the end of March, early April. So from a timing standpoint, we may find information out earlier than that, but I'm conservative, so I look at the past for the future, and I'm anticipating right around that April 1 date is when we'll get the results of their evaluation. All right, so capital recovery fees, I guess a couple things. These aren't paid by all customers. It's new development or increased development. Essentially when somebody's connecting to the system, or in the case of one of the fees that we have, it being annexed in and paying the annexation component. Now, I'm using some of the terminology a little differently throughout this, but there are a lot of different names for these types of fees, and some do different things. So this is going to be important as we talk about how the district has accomplished this historically and tied into some of the recommendations moving forward. But it's around recovering from that new customer. I call it the field of dreams problem. We got to build it before they come and finance it. So once people connect, we want to recover that. There's no legal requirement that we have to have these. These are very common in the West. There's no legal requirement they have to have these. Some entities don't have them, and they just fund everything through their user charges. As you may imagine, existing customers, don't always want to play the bank and finance expansions of the system and cash flow things. So that's kind of their history and why they've come about. Ultimately, it's intended to recover the cost and the impact of that new customer on the system. So it's not all types of capital, and it's really intended to be, we've added this or we've expanded this. Here's your portion of it, and a one-time fee to recover that rather than doing it over a number of years. It can also be used to pay debt service. Sometimes people think of these as only available at cash fund capital, but I actually think debt service is a great match with these because that sort of breaks the financing cost as well as that revenue and matches those two together over time. So from a business standpoint, that's kind of liability and asset. That's a good match rather than building things and then recovering it in smaller pieces over time or cash flowing stuff. Ultimately, it's around the backbone system and the pipes and the reservoirs and storage components, and that's what we're looking to recover. And again, there's a little bit of equity between existing customers and new customers in terms of the cost of these. There's certainly case law and there's litigation around this within Montana, but also throughout the country. Montana statutes, speak to these fees and influence and affect some of the constraints that entities have, and like any sort of statutory requirement, there's some gray, there's some black and white, and different points of view in terms of what where those lines are between the white, the gray, and the black. So let's talk a bit about the District's 2 capital recovery fees, and we've got one that is a little bit more of the tap fee. I'm terming it the service connection. And so the new customer calls and or wants to connect to the system. This is intended to recover a portion of those costs, but also the meter. And so there's a outlay and a cost to the district for the meter and the parts, as well as the sort of labor and personnel costs, administrative costs to install it, to connect it, and to get that customer going. So that's really the intent with, and it starts at $1,830 for the lower meter sizes, and increases with the larger meter sizes. A 6-inch meter is a lot more expensive than a 3/4-inch meter, and the cost to install it's more complex. It takes more time.
Question.
Now, yes, sir.
Josh, how much does a meter cost normally?
I don't know, we just I'd have to look at
Let's say a 3/4-inch meter at this point,
over,
about 500,
Oh, higher than that.
yeah, probably with the electronics and then the brass body itself.
500, so 18. And for, let's say, a commercial building, we would
So-
probably put 2 inches,
Oh,
is
that
that correct?
6-inch was 125 or something like that we had to get for
125,000 for the meter.
something like that. Off top.
Thank you.
That could be wrong.
Now, this fee also covers office costs to add the customer, get it in the system for billing and meter reading and all of that, which is part of this system development fee as well, correct?
There's pieces of it, and I think that there's also an additional charge to sort of set up an account that's pretty nominal. That's a component. So I mean, we've got a couple other much smaller fees for a couple of those activities, but yes, I mean there's that new customer, and it's more than just physically installing the meter. There's a couple other components to it as well.
This is one reason why I ran.
Mhm.
To be here on that board, to make sure we get development in the Heights. And there was always a question with the Heights Water Board as to what they were doing to stifle business to the Heights, okay? So I'm very curious, I've read it already to see where we're going, but hopefully we're gonna find out some of these connection fees and the costs that we've had to implement in the past, that we can take a look at the future, especially with all the development that's going on in the Heights, that we need to look at, not only into new residential areas and zones, but for other businesses that are gonna come into. So, I read it, but I'm glad we're gonna look at it, and that was the one reason why I wanted to know, how much was a meter? It's $1,000 or whatever it is for 1 meter, my gosh, I didn't know that, I thought they'd be about $500, so.
It adds up, and those costs have been increasing too. And that's something where Josh, I don't know the number 10 years ago, but my guess is that that's grown faster than the overall inflation.
Can I jump ahead? So your increase is $3,070 for residential connection.
Yeah, well, and this is one it's really hard to do an apples to apples comparison, in part because we've got this other component that some customers get accessed with that annexation fee too. But go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the question.
Well, no, I'm just, as he was talking, is this gonna have an effect on the growth in the Heights with developers?
This is one of those topics that there's some strong opinions, and certainly the development community will often make claims that I think are maybe not as true as they sort of make them out to be. And so that's one of them, is that it's gonna stifle new development. And so, we can maybe talk about this or kind of have this additional discussion at a later date, as, you're considering and looking at all the kind of moving pieces. But the kind of the one thing that I'll say is that, the price of a home's gone up, I don't know, local markets, but it's increased. I would say higher than, the general inflation. Now, at that same time, the district didn't increase their tap fee. So there's maybe some other drivers that were influencing the price of a home, or the profitability, or the willingness of buyers to pay for it. So while, and certainly when this policy comes up, the claim will be it's gonna be cost plus. And I think it's a little more complex than that. And there's some additional factors that influence it, not just as a component, but, and it's a component of the bottom line too. It's a cost. It's one of those, things end up maybe having a few pieces, and they're not always as simple as sometimes is how they're maybe articulated. But
Maybe I'm too far ahead in this, but when we're $1,700 higher than Bozeman and $1,800 higher than the city of Billings.
It's not true. Let's keep going, I think
You
we'll
might-
get there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
might
think you'll
answer
see
your
that.
questions along the way.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So I guess in kind of setting the stage, and a lot of these we talked about, but in terms of some recommendations with these fees. I think some of the history and certainly these have worked for the district and worked well, but like anything, sometimes there's some changes. So I'm proposing that we, this capital recovery fee for the backbone facilities, we go to a single fee for that. Right now, it's somewhat spread across the two. Now, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, that what I'm terming as a connection fee, the equivalent, the future $1,830, that we need to make sure that we're covering the meter costs and district installation costs. And that's something that we're kind of still looking at a little bit, exactly what that number is. And I don't have a firm proposal on those today, but certainly before now and April, that's something that we'll tighten up a bit.
So what you're saying with this consolidate, you're talking about eliminating the annexation fee and having one new fee for new customers. Do I understand you right? You're gonna eliminate the annexation fee and have one fee.
Mostly. Yes, and there may actually still be two fees as they show up, but I'm proposing they to be based on meter size and increasing, and
Right.
certainly somebody can add the two together and get to effectively a single fee.
So that's, looking ahead, we're gonna see the big rate increase. But that page also doesn't have the annexation fee, it's
Gone is the
So-
recommendation.
This is what you're bringing us to, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
And there's a couple other, recommendations around this. We look at these kind of periodic comprehensive studies, we make some changes, but in the future, indexing this consolidated fee for actual costs, increase of the meter costs, and or inflationary index. Engineering news record is one that we use. It's around the kind of facilities and the costs that utility experiences. So, that maintaining that annually will mitigate future big stepped increases and sort of pass our best guess for what inflation is for capital facilities. And certainly update it. We have a big change on capital plan or another master plan or a refresh on that, and may drive the district to update this, and certainly more than every 20 years. And as was discussed, sort of that connection fee component, that's something that, as the meter cost changes, the district can certainly update that with some of the other fees. Now, the last recommendation is somewhat off topic, but it's a related one. The cost for the annexation activity. Somebody wants to annex in, and we got to go through the process with the county, and there's a lot of time and some administrative stuff, both with the customer as well as the county, that we don't charge for today. That as we're talking with staff, we think it makes sense to have an additional activity-based fee around this, and this really is recovering the cost primarily of district personnel to complete those activities. So again, this is one of those that I'm maybe not as focused in on this recommendation today, but I just wanted to add that that's something that we do today and we don't charge for, at least not explicitly.
No, Josh, could you interject how much time you think
So what it's saying-
you
what it's
and
saying is
staff
We
spend?
still have to, we have to get all the legal descriptions, put everything together, we have to submit that to the county clerk and recorder, we have to submit that to the secretary of state. So every year, so anything that does get developed, so it's like on that map, anything that
Yes.
goes from blue to red, we still have to document that, and we still have to,
How much time
submit
does
that.
it take on an average annexation, do you estimate? I mean, this is coming off the top, I understand.
yeah, it varies depending on, like last time I made, I think 5 separate trips down to the clerk and recorder, cause every time I went down there,
So it is
I
time
saw somebody else
consuming.
that wanted more and different information, so it just, yeah, as we're trying to get some of that stuff ironed out, that,
But this would eliminate, like now somebody comes in, I've got my 3-acre piece, but my house is here, I only wanna annex 10,000
Right, we're not
square
gonna-
feet. That
we're
would
not gonna talk
eliminate
about the
that
23
completely.
cents per square foot, yeah.
Right.
It wouldn't be that for the annexation.
Right.
It would be more of a
Paperwork
administrative
charge.
document fee of,
Maybe
whatever
a
we
couple
talk
$100
about.
or,
Yeah.
I mean, something,
Right.
and granted, and this is something we can follow up on, I know as we've been talking about, that there's maybe some extremes, but there's a little bit of an average, just even between, you know, going to the county, and some days you're waiting in line for
Right.
a while, or if, you know, sometimes there's a few trips, and I don't know, we were gonna base the recommendation on the worst case, but really kind of finding a little bit of that average, and I know we haven't, you know, fleshed that out fully in terms of exactly all those costs, but I'd consider it to be fairly nominal, you know, and just more of an
Compared
administrative
to
activity fee.
$10,000 a
Sure.
acre, it's nominal fee.
yeah.
And
like
the
we're
10,000
talking-
isn't just for the administrative part.
No,
but-
I don't
Oh,
understand,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
understand. That's why the meter charge tap fees are going up, just to recover these charges.
So let me talk a little bit as I look at time. It's often the case I get a little carried away and spend a little more time during the presentation. So I'm not going to focus on this as much, but just in terms of methodology, the recommendation for the capital recovery fee is based on the incremental. And that's based on the expansionary capital facilities we're anticipating over this 10-year period and what it costs to add that capacity to the system. At the end of the day, whether it's backward-looking, forward-looking, or a blend of a hybrid, ultimately what we're, you know, the methodologies are a component to assess and arrive at the answer, what is the unit cost of new development or expanding the system to serve new development? And the result isn't as important as the driver. So in this case, we're having to expand some of our capacity in our reservoirs. And so that unit cost of that capacity isn't maybe a legacy cost of 20 years ago, it's the cost in the future of adding that capacity. And that's not always the case for all utilities, but that's why we're proposing the incremental, is because it gives us the result of answering that question, not, you know, just because we like the outcome. Now we get there, and I'm not going to focus exactly on this, but it's a mathematical process with certainly some complexity. We joke a little bit. It's A divided by B times the demands, but there's a lot that goes into what A is and what B is, and certainly a lot of discussion with district staff and interstate staff and how we go about this. Now, as was indicated, the proposed fee is we have a single one-time fee plus, and this is where we develop out this second part of the table, what that exact cost or those costs should be by meter size for passing through the cost of the meter, its parts, and the district installation of it. So that's sort of off to the right that we'd add to this, but the more substantial piece would be that one-time fee. $4,900 for a 3/4 inch meter. There's some additional basis for this recommendation in that doing it by meter size. Not to say the per acre approach or per square foot approach, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little more individualized and more complex, give people, sort of options, and taking it to meter size is more of the way that, you know, kind of the industry has handled this historically. And that it also gives a little more kind of fixed certainty for the development community. It's a little less variable about, you know, it's a question like, what about this? Or I'm not gonna develop, you know, now, those things will drive the size of the meter. And this is a little bit more of a simplification in terms of how we recover that from new development.
Now,
Now,
when you got those one-time fees, can you give me an example of areas besides Billings, where this is being implemented, like Fort Collins, or this is a universal thing that people are doing? Oh, there we go. Sorry.
no, it's great. Let Red in. So this is a little bit more of a localized comparison. And so these are, you know, as the question earlier that was posed, not just the Billings area. We've got Bozeman included in this comparison. But for a 3/4 inch residential connection, you know, what do some of the entities charge? And there's a little bit more to this with, you know, the type of development and some of the footprint, as Bozeman's fee schedule a little more complicated. They're not just by meter size. They factor in some other components. They get to the size of the house and the size of the lot. Laurel is the lowest in this group, and Lockwood, and this is just the water fee. So this doesn't include other types of capital recovery fees, if it's sewer, if they do water and sewer. This is just water. But so we can see, you know, the district is, and this one's a little trickier to estimate. I'm estimating around 2,500 with somebody that's paying the annexation fee. This doesn't include the meter charge, because again, that's a little bit of a separate charge. And but we're a little bit, you know, kind of in the survey group, a little lower than what the average would be. Certainly the city about 3,000 is kind of in the middle of this group. And then, as is proposed, this would put the district maybe a little bit at the higher end, again, of this group. This is for single-family residential development. Lockwood has had about a $6,000 fee going back to a study that was completed in 2017, and they've continued to develop pretty healthily. So, you know, there's certainly some other drivers besides just.
But my
the
only
fee.
consideration on the fact that, you know, like, if you, as you noted there, Lockwood includes their sewer. Okay, Billings probably includes their sewer. Bozeman probably, they don't.
No.
This is just water itself.
You got it, just water. So, and I prepared it, and we looked at this in May, but I don't wanna confuse things. I know what the sewer component is as well, and we can, you know, provide a chart that shows that for water and sewer connection. But yeah, it's as apples to apples as I can get this, and just water only.
That's very expensive. Well, we keep going, I know where.
Can we go back a page, cause you touched on it, that these fees are derived from the user plus demand and our capacity.
Mhm.
But we're increasing the small meters a lot heavier percentage than the big meters. And the big tap fees, like the 4-inch or 6 or 8, really hit our demand hard compared to a 3/4. But the increase to like a 4-inch is like 1%, but the increase to a 3/4 inch is 1.67%, a lot higher. But yet that 4-inch is gonna hit our demand and make our flows, there's a name for it, really gonna hit us. Shouldn't they be paying for that, or is it the number of people? I'm a little lost on your formula you've got here with the value and the system and the demand equaling this increase. I'm just a little lost on that, because the bigger flows affect our capacity so much more than a 3/4 does, and that's why I'm lost.
Also, when you have a 3/4 inch service, usually it's into a neighborhood development.
Right.
So you're gonna have
Quite a few.
30 or 40 of those,
And
and a 4-inch you might have one.
And it's gonna really hit that whole area's flow even more than 30 3/4 inch in that same type of an area. That's where I'm a little lost on your formula. And I'd like a little, you've done it, you've done the work, you explained it throughout, but I'm a little short on it. It just doesn't quite add up to me.
As I understand it, Andrew, this is our best way of generating money for the water district, our connection fees and this. Am I correct?
Well, monthly user charge is the best way, it's most predictable.
Yeah, but for now, for building our base funds down there, every time somebody connects.
It's an opportunity, like you get it once and you can't go back, and so yeah, I mean, that's where, you know, you kind of get one shot at it, and then, you know, if you don't charge the cost, then you're making it up over time.
These are,
Yeah,
for
not
also,
really.
these are also based on areas outside the district's current annexation, or annexed areas.
So that's the other important part, is that, you know, just with the history that, you know, and some people have already paid this fee historically through paying their annexation fee and not developed. So this isn't gonna generate as much revenue, as it would if, you know, there wasn't that history in there, and you're, you know, Judge, you're good, I should have emphasized that it's a significant revenue stream, but it's not as significant as it could be, because there was some practices in the past that enabled people to essentially pay that at a historical price, you know, years ago. And the district, you know, built capital facility, did things with money, so it was used, and there was a driver, but it reduces the revenue potential moving forward. I guess to answer sort of the question, and maybe this is something that, you know, we can sort of have a separate discussion on, but that 3/4 inch meter demand, it's a 3/4 inch meter equivalent ultimately is what we look at, because we want to bring it down to a single kind of common denominator. And so, I mean, your point is a very good one, but we try and bring it all down to a 3/4 inch equivalent, where 3/4 inch is 1, but that 4-inch meter is counted, the ratio escapes me, but say like 5 times.
Oh, it's
Or-
like 16 times.
Well, okay, yeah, I mean, the multiple, I was probably a little low there, and I can confirm what that is. So that's kind of behind the scenes, and then we calculate and we use that common denominator so we can set that base fee that's most of the connections we have and most of the future connections. And then when we do this assessment schedule, that relationship, that 52,267 is that ratio of capacity for the 4-inch to that 3/4 inch. Now, different users, and you're right, 4-inch is gonna sort of place more demands typically on the system, certainly in the 3/4 inch, but even the 4-inch, there's a lot of play in there that, you know, there's a fair amount of water variance even just within that meter size, and much more than a 3/4 inch. And we have many fewer of those large connections as well.
Well, right, and most of our big connections, 4-inch and whatnot, are for a fire system, which doesn't use any water until there's a fire. So it's not affecting our system. Should we have a separate system development fee for fire service as we do for commercial, residential, or whatever? Should that system development fee be different for fire service? The city doesn't charge a system development fee for fire service. We do. So should we stop that, or what is your rationale? Because like you say, if you're gonna use the 4-inch for a true, and you need it, a restaurant, for instance, uses a ton of water in a month compared to a house. But restaurants, commercial in the city gets a real cheap rate. You've got a commercial rate and a residential rate. But that's pretty much flat. Their water use is the same Monday as it is Sunday, as it is August, as it is December or January. They're pretty flat. A household is not flat. It has some serious peaks in the summer times and low in the winter time. But this fire is Zippo until there's a fire. But we still have to have the capacity as a district to give it its water when that flame starts up and that system turns on. So where do we go to be equitable here? Is it necessary, or is it just one of them things where we do the best we can and this is where we're at?
I'm gonna suggest maybe that's something that I follow up on, because it's a pretty dense topic in of itself. You highlighted a lot of the key elements, but the practices on what to do with the development fee associated with the private fire line connections, kind of the drivers, maybe we save that for, you know, future discussion,
Right.
and kind of come back with a little bit more direct information around that, some consideration, because it is a pretty dense topic. and it also, it's important to those users, but it's maybe not as, it doesn't cut across the same users as some of the other fees that we're gonna be talking about. So let me jump ahead, and I guess one thing, and I need to correct this should say commercial capital recovery fee. So this one was residential, and this shows commercial. And I know we talked about this before, but for most of these, they do it by meter size, they don't vary it by class. These are the same. Now you'll see some differences for Bozeman and certainly Billings with the fees that they assess for commercial. And I've double checked this a few times. I pulled this off the ordinance. Billings charges about $9,300 for a commercial 3/4 inch water connection. And so they're certainly for this fee assessing more than what Lockwood does or anyone
This
in the
is
service
supposed
group.
to say commercial, not residential.
Yeah, I apologize.
So you're keeping our tap fees uniform for commercial, residential, and everybody. It's all gonna stay like it is now.
Meter size, regardless of class, and certainly, that may be something in the future boards could evaluate differently, but yeah, it's based on meter size regardless of class is the recommendation. So I got myself, so I'm gonna move ahead maybe a little bit more quickly on a couple of these, and certainly, cost of service is another one of those dense topics, and I guess at the end of the day, what we're looking at is everybody paying their fair costs. There's some drivers, some things behind the scenes, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions. But it's come up a couple times for water system. This is the most significant driver. You've got demands, annual demands, but in terms of building the system and providing the service, and the cost of service approach that we as an industry often use for rate setting is the base extra capacity method. That is around recognizing not just in terms of really in the rate recovery, that idea that if we had a system of customers that use the same amount of water every day, year round, our system would look a lot different than it does. Now we're in the West, and we've got peak seasons, and largely these are irrigation based, and so not just kind of that day, if you will, or that peak day, but that sort of summer season. We've got pipes that are sized, that are idle, that have capacity, say in the wintertime, that we stress a little bit more in the summertime, and really into that sort of peak day, and whether that's July or August, it kind of depends on the summer when it's hot and people are irrigating. So that's effectively the system that we've designed. And the analogy is that I've heard that I always liked on this is AT&T, back when they were the telecom utility, the monopoly, they designed and had enough of the landlines and the little straws so that on Mother's Day and Christmas, we could all call our moms or, call family, and they would have the capacity to connect all those calls. So for a water system, that's a similar analogy, but it just happens to be the hottest day typically during the driest period of the year. And, there's a lot behind the scenes on this, and certainly happy to talk through this, but kind of getting to that outcome or the result, is we looked at, in this case, 23-24, if we adjust our user charges 14% of that need that we've identified in that financial planning process, that takes us from about $5 million in those charges from those same customers without the rate change up that 14% or $700,000. Now, as we look at residential, non-residential, commercial, it's effectively everybody that isn't residential or isn't irrigation only. On a sort of customer class basis, we see some differences. And while these are compartmentalized in classes, there's effectively non-residential customers through the totality of the user charges are paying more than what their cost of service is. And irrigation and residential are paying under. Now, this is one of the key steps in direction that I'm looking and we're looking at, I'm about to show you rates that resolve this in effectively one step in 1 year. And maybe we want to take a couple years in terms of the classes of getting that right and maybe stepping into some of these changes. And this is a little bit of some of the options we have. And I guess, without getting too much detail, one of the reasons why there's that subsidy is it goes back to the peak usage. Residential irrigation only have those higher peaks in that irrigation season relative to commercial. It doesn't mean a commercial doesn't peak. It just means that they tend maybe a little less or fewer customers on the commercial side. And there's some other dynamics I want to get into with the billing data that I will save for that discussion in a couple slides. So I guess in terms of setting the stage with our monthly user charges, there's really two, and say three components where we've got a monthly charge per bill that increases by meter size, and then we add to that $1.30 for all meter sizes for a service line repair fee. So it's roughly $23.50 for most of our customers, those 3/4 inch customers, regardless of the amount of water they use. Now we pick up water usage, and that's where the tiered rate structure comes into play. The first 3,300 gallons is built into or incorporated. I won't even say it's built into, but it's incorporated with that fixed charge. So after 3,300, that's when the meter rate effectively starts. And that's $4.48. Most customers really, most residential customers, maybe in the summer they get above that, or some larger users, bigger lot owners, maybe more regularly, but most are gonna live in that block 2. And it's either between the minimum and block 2, most bills, or many throughout the year. Now, above 20,000 gallons, we step up that rate about 90 cents per 1,000 gallon. And that, again, covers a lot of the users of the system through 50,000 gallons. And then we take that additional step. Now, going back a couple of slides to this isn't just because of the class and the peak usage. The other driver here is these allocations are the same. If you're a 3/4 inch meter, a 2 inch meter, or 4 inch meter, you get the first 3,300 in your base charge. Base charge is gonna be a little bit more, and then the tiered rate schedule kicks in from there. So what we're seeing is that larger users and larger meter sizes, we're getting more of our volume revenue in the higher tiers. And this is very common when an entity, a district has what I characterize kind of one-size-fits-all tiered rate structure. And it's kind of, an average that doesn't really fit anybody. And that's a little bit of the dynamic that we're seeing in the cost of service. Now, to help illustrate this approach as well as kind of where the customers are, we looked at residential, commercial, and then a couple of our other additional non-residential users. In terms of the number of bills, one bill a month throughout the year, 85% of the system, of the bills we issue are those residential 3/4 inch and less meter sizes. Then we start picking up the inch and larger, about 6% of the system. As we go through commercial, again, a lot at that 3/4 inch, but certainly not as many as residential. And then our irrigation only is only 1% of the customers we have. Now, contrasting that with the usage, so residential 3/4 inch and less makes up 85% of the connections, but only 55% of the use. And that's even with the lawn watering, the seasonal irrigation. And then we pick up some of the larger residential customers, and certainly that account to usage relationship is a little closer to 1-to-1. And then we start getting into commercial or irrigation only, where it's only 1% of our accounts are irrigation only, but it's 5% of our usage. And that's where some of the peak usage comes from. So there's a little bit of the dynamic that not every connection is the same, but at the end of the day, about 90% of our customers are those 3/4 inch and less between residential and commercial. The other kind of interesting thing that I wanted to sort of highlight, and this speaks to, we've got the same components, the 3/4 inch and less, greater than 3/4 inch, same sort of user base. So when we look at, say, irrigation only, or those handful of water retailers that we have, their percent of their usage in tier 4, irrigation only is about 70%. And those handful of water retailers are about 90% of their usage is in that higher tier. That's the downside of a one-size-fits-all tiered rate structure, is those bigger users, larger meters, are going to blow through those initial tiers. And on the flip side, our residential customers, we don't want to see a lot of red for those users, because we're essentially, we're not trying to recover and design our rates to have that as much usage in tier 4, but it's a really small percentage. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that first 3,300 gallons that every customer gets adds up. So it's about, for residential 3/4 inch and less, it's about 30% of the usage for that set of users is in the free water. Now, as we get out to the kind of system-wide, and that's everybody, that gets a little bit smaller, and it's about 1/4 of our usage. Again, we're not charging directly for it. And so from a financial business standpoint, I see that as, that there's a risk there for the district. And so there's a couple of ways that this manifests itself in some of the recommendations. So I'm going to jump there. Eliminating that minimum water allowance in the base rate, I think, is